Morning. So excited as Curtis was just mentioning about our meeting that has started. We're very blessed to be with you this morning, and I'm glad you all made it here safely, and looking forward to being together the rest of the week. You know, if you were to ask the question, what is water? You might look it up in a dictionary. I think most of us know what water is. We experience water. We know how it relates to us. We know the necessity of it. But if you want to know what water is, you don't ask a fish, do you? For one thing, they won't answer you. But for another thing, is water just seems to know, a fish just seems to accept water for what it is. A fish doesn't know that it is wet. And in the same way, culture is for humans what water is for fish. The environment we live in, we come to think of as just normal. We don't even think about the fact that we are wet with culture. The difference is, unlike fish in the water, humans create their own culture. But like the fish immersed in water, we become so immersed in the ways of thinking and the patterns of living that we become unable to recognize them. For example, you and I might travel to the mountains, and we look at the mountains, and the mountains are beautiful. We're just amazed by the sunset that happens over the mountains, and we just think it's just a wonderful thing. But you think about those people who live in the mountains, yeah, they may appreciate it, but maybe not as much as we do, because they get used to it. They see this every single day. Or maybe another example is of a dysfunctional family. Many times people who grow up in a dysfunctional family don't know that it's dysfunctional. They're just used to it. They just think that's the way that it is, just like a fish thinks that water is normal as well. And so the battle that we have as Christians that we face is living lives that are influenced by the culture that is all around us and not even realizing that it is affecting us. And that's why this week we're going to be looking at the battles that we face with culture around us. We're going to be looking at cultural norms, things that our culture has come to view as normal, but we must swim against the stream. And so I want us to begin this morning by looking at some very basics about battling these cultural norms. I want us to build upon as we go throughout this week. Some foundational principles that I want us to look at. And I think we need to start by simply defining what culture is here this morning. You know, among Christians, culture is a word that we use quite a bit, but we hardly ever define it. So what do we mean when we use the word culture? Well, the word culture actually comes from a Latin word, cultura, which is from which we get agriculture from. And so you think about a farmer, he goes out and he cultivates the land. That's the idea behind culture. Like a farmer with a field, culture is what we do with the world. We're cultivating something. And so it is an amoral term, that means that it's neither good nor bad in and of itself. Culture becomes good or bad based upon what society does with our culture, with the world in which we live with. And so as a result, throughout the world and throughout time, there are different cultures. In some cultures, people love their neighbors. In other cultures, people eat their neighbors. And so the difference between cultures is reflected in a society's worldview. A worldview is how we come to view the world around us. And generally, worldviews are established by our religion. Religion changes culture like nothing else does. In the same country or land, there may be a culture that changed because its religion changes, or at least people's view of religion changes. And so when we're talking about cultural norms this week, we're talking about what a society considers normal because of the culture that we have created. In our culture, driving cars is a normal thing now. You don't see too many horses and buggies going down the street. But there is a culture up in Ohio or in Pennsylvania where that would be the case. Or it is within our culture that most people retire in their 60s. But there are some who retire early. There are some who retire later than that. In our culture, it is normal for people to have babies in the hospital. But there again are some women who go against the cultural norm, and they might have their babies at home. And so, again, culture is what is normally accepted, or at least cultural norms are what is normally accepted by the culture around us. But sometimes it helps to define a term by understanding what it does not include. So I'm going to talk about a few things that culture is not, so that we understand what we're talking about as we go throughout this week. First of all, I want you to understand that culture is not natural. It's not instinctive. In other words, God didn't create culture. We create culture by our own free will. Now, God tells us how we ought to create culture, but most people choose not to do it His way. But the fact is it doesn't come naturally. We create it. Second of all, culture is not evil in and of itself. Culture does not refer to all the bad things that humans do. And I think sometimes as Christians, that's how we think of culture. We sometimes use the word culture or a synonym of bad music. Well, that's just our culture, or alternative lifestyles, or liberal education, or addictive behavior, or immoral dressing, or immodest dressing, or other worldly things. I think sometimes we say the culture is destroying our kids, or the culture is destroying the church. And I get that. We try to protect our kids from the influences of our culture around us. The parents of my generation tried to protect us from the culture that brought us Three's Company and Aerosmith and the Soviet Union and Bill Clinton. And the culture seems to be pretty tamed when you look at the culture I grew up in compared to a culture that now gives us TikTok and Taylor Swift and Hamas and Supreme Court decisions. Certainly culture consists of bad things, but it is incomplete to think as these things as the culture. Culture includes the good and the bad and the morally neutral things. And so culture simply is what society makes it out to be. And it happens to be just right now that our culture in 21st century America is more evil than it is good. But generally speaking, cultural is amoral in and of itself. Thirdly, I want you to understand that culture is not people. People make culture. They are not the culture, though. I want you to understand that. And in turn, people are affected by culture. And that's why we're preaching this series this week. But people are not culture, and culture is not the people. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Because if we see people as the culture, then culture is the enemy, and then we're going to see people around us as the enemy. But they're not. And I want you to understand that. That they are neighbors that we must love, who are also being tempted to be affected by our culture around us. We must love the people, and we must attack what they are doing and what they are thinking, but we cannot attack them. There's a big difference between those two. And fourthly, as I've already alluded to, I want you to understand that culture also changes. It used to be normal in our society, in our country, for people to get married and to stay married for life. That was the culture in which our society lived in. It was also normal for us to be able to answer the telephone without knowing who was calling before we answered the phone. You remember those days? And you had to stay in the room where you answered the phone because it was corded to the wall. You remember that? It was normal for me, actually, growing up. We had a party line. And so you had to get on the phone first, and you had to see, make sure my neighbor down the road is not on the phone first, or make sure they're not listening to a conversation that I'm going to have here. It was also culturally accepted to wear bell bottoms at one point, or leisure suits. So we're thankful that culture does change sometimes, right? It was a culture for us to have mullets when I was in high school. I did not have one, but for some reason people are bringing those back. I don't know why. It seems like we would have learned our lesson from some of those things. But I want you to understand, most of those things I just mentioned are no longer part of our culture. What one generation considers normal, the next generation may seem to think that's odd, that's strange. And that's okay with some things, but not when it comes to moral issues. In years past, there was a time in our country when it was easier to have a deep Christian commitment. You just have to admit that it was easier. Back in the good old days, you might say, that the religion was an acceptable social outlet, that culture accepted. It was looked upon as a good thing because most people were religious. Everybody held religious beliefs, and everybody in the neighborhood went to church on Sunday morning. I remember in fourth grade, I grew up in Mississippi, and in fourth grade, the first day of school, everybody was in alphabetical order. I was usually near the front, having the last name start with Brown, and they went around. The teacher, Mrs. Ware, she had us all introduce ourselves, and we got to the last boy in class, Billy Zimmerman. And by the way, she told us to not only introduce ourselves, tell us what our name is, but also tell you where you go to church. Got to Billy Zimmerman. Billy said, "My name is Billy Zimmerman, and we don't go to church." And everybody's like, "Oh, that just wasn't socially acceptable. That wasn't the culture, the norm back then." Think about how much that's changed. Probably if you did that same thing in school today and went around and said, well, first of all, they wouldn't say, "Where do you go to church?" I doubt there'd be very many people who actually do go to church. There was a time in our country when you had gospel meetings that hundreds of people would turn out. They were anxious to hear that. In fact, they've been looking forward to it for months. And in those days, Christian moral standards were understood and they were appreciated. And it made it easy in that culture in that day to hold to Christian beliefs. But let's face it, that's not the way that it is today. And today, we live in a culture where religion doesn't have much place in the public, except for to be ridiculed. Our culture's values now run completely and totally contrary to New Testament teachings. For example, the world today is obsessed with sex, as it has never been before. Sexual activities apart from marriage are considered acceptable, and they are considered normal by more and more people around us. And the concept of commitment, especially in the area of marriage, has all but disappeared. The idea of self-discipline has been replaced by a doctrine of self-gratification. And things like honesty and integrity are just memories of the past. And I say all this to say that sometimes culture changes, and that's not always a good thing. Now, before I leave this point, this has been pretty negative, but I want to also leave it on a positive note here. And if culture can change, the hope for us is to change culture one person at a time. We can come out of this. Not all is lost. We can change this world around us by reflecting the light of Jesus in our lives. But let me also add to this confusion about our understanding of culture by also inserting the fact that we have to understand that there are subcultures to our culture. There are cultures within cultures. Though there are some culture, there is culture that spans all across our society, there are some trends and fashions that distinguish some groups from other people. There are ideas that distinguish and lifestyles that distinguish people even within culture. For example, there is an urban culture and there is a country culture. There is a blue-collar culture and a white-collar culture. We understand those types of things. There is also a homeschooling culture and a public schooling culture. There's an East Coast culture and a West Coast culture. None of these things are necessarily bad in and of themselves, but there are subcultures within the overall culture in and of itself. Even within churches, it's interesting to see a culture. Churches have their own culture from congregation to congregation. There's just different ways of thinking. I'm not saying any of them are wrong, but different ways of doing things within the authority of Christ. In our country, though, it is accurate to speak of cultures in the plural. But there's a sense in which we're all affected by the overall culture of our country. Now, one other thing, as we talk about principles that I want to lay down, I want to ask the question, what is it that controls our culture then? And I think the answer to that is ideas. For example, it is a growing idea in our culture, in our country rather, that truth is not absolute. We're going to talk more about this in the next hour. But that truth is more a matter of opinion. Now, I want you to understand that is very much a Western idea. But those ideas are not in the Islamic cultures around the world, for example. And when you have bad ideas, it ends up in bad results. It ends up in a bad culture. When you have the idea that living for the moment and immediate gratification is the way that you ought to live, then you end up with a culture that is sexually promiscuous and in debt up to their ears. On the other hand, when you have good ideas, then you end up with good culture. And these ideas are often spread by their champions. In the past, those champions were philosophers and academics and writers. But today, our champions of culture are entertainers. They are the social media influencers. They are the YouTubers. In no time in history has society been influenced more by entertainers than ours has been. That's why an athlete can come out or a musician can come out and say, you need to vote for this politician. All of a sudden, especially among young people, they flock to that particular politician. Or the news, or even the president himself may be an influencer. But the main influence of any culture is its institutions. And the primary institution of any society, the three main institutions, are family, religious groups, and government. Which, by the way, correspond with the three institutions that God has set up. That is family, the religious, the church, and government. The problem in our country is that the family unit, in a biblical sense, is fading away. And churches are diminishing in our country, and the ones that are seeming to flourish somewhat are far from what God wants. And that leaves the government, and we see what it decides. But these age-old institutions are being replaced by other institutions, such as educational institutions and financial institutions. And as their ideas change, so do our culture. They influence our culture through academics and through marketing. And so these ideas soon become the norm. And so the challenge for us as Christians is not to allow their ways of thinking, their ideas to influence us and our actions. This is a constant battle that we are facing. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4, though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. For we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking captive every thought into obedience of Christ. There are ideas, there are thoughts that are circulating all around us. But we have to have our thoughts captivated by Christ. And I don't think there's any doubt that it is increasingly difficult to be a New Testament disciple of Jesus Christ. No longer is it considered respectable in our culture to hold religious views. But what I do want you to understand is that this is not a new battle for Christians. In fact, the Hebrew Christians in the first century battled with these cultural norms as well. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, will you open them up to Hebrews chapter 13? That's where I want to spend the rest of our time in this hour. And I want to give you just a little bit of background to this particular passage. Throughout the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer has been writing to Jewish Christians in the first century who were tempted to go back into their old ways of thinking, to leave the Christian faith and go back into Judaism. Maybe it was because of persecution. It could be because of a number of different reasons. But what the Hebrew writer does is he goes throughout this particular book and he gives reasons why Jesus is far greater than anything in the Old Testament. Jesus is greater than the prophets. He is greater than the angels. He is greater than Moses, the lawgiver. He is a better deliverer than Joshua. He is a better high priest than any Levitical priest, and so forth and so on. The new law is better than the old law. That's what he's been developing up through the most of the book, even into chapter 10. And as he comes to the last part of the book, as Paul does, I'm not saying that Hebrews was written by Paul, but like Paul does in many of his letters, he establishes all these doctrinal things, and then at the very end of each of these letters, he gives us applications. What does this mean to our lives? That's what chapter 13 is now. If Jesus is greater than so many all these other things, how does this affect our lives? And it's so important that we understand these practical things. So here's what he does. In verses 1 through 3, he talks about, well, if Jesus is greater and he has an influence in your life, you're going to be shown love. And you're going to show hospitality. And you're going to show sympathy. And in verse 4, he mentions the need for sexual purity. And in verses 5 and 6, he deals with covetousness. And he talks about the importance of being satisfied with what we have. In verses 7 through 9, he encourages these Christians to be steadfast in the faith. But I want you to notice, beginning in verse 10 here, he begins a passage on the importance of separating ourselves from the culture around us. Beginning in verse 10, he says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat." He's talking about the Jewish priest under the Jewish system. He says, we have a different type of altar. "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate." Now notice here. This is a letter, again, that is written to Jewish Christians who were very familiar with Old Testament practices. And under the old law, you could bring a free will offering, a thanksgiving offering. And what you would do is you bring that offering and you would sacrifice it yourself, but you would also eat of that sacrifice. But if it was a burnt offering, a sin offering for one of your own sins, you would bring that offering and it was not to be eaten. In fact, it was to be taken and burned outside of the camp. Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 30. And they were to be considered unclean. They were dumped outside the camp in what amounted to this large garbage heap outside of the city. And so the Hebrew writer wants us to see how fitting that is that Jesus was crucified outside the camp of Jerusalem. He wants us to realize that Christianity didn't begin with a great deal of public acceptance. Understand that Jesus didn't receive any awards recognizing him as the Jewish young man of the year in 33 AD. And there was no eternal flame burning for Jesus at the Jerusalem National Cemetery. He's killed on a cross. The Jewish culture in Jerusalem rejected Jesus. And we're reminded that the actual crucifixion of Jesus took place outside of the city of Jerusalem. And you might remember, literally, Jesus went to Golgotha, Calvary, outside of Jerusalem, that place of the skull where he was crucified. It was a place outside of the realm of acceptance and respectability. Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two great candles there. Instead, he was crucified on a cross in between two thieves. He was killed basically on the garbage dump of the town. It is the kind of place where cynics talk smuck and where thieves curse and where soldiers would gamble. The cross meant a lot of things, but first and foremost, it meant shame and reproach. And that's where Jesus was killed by the people of his culture. And the message of the cross was a continuous source of rejection for the early church. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22? "Indeed, Jews ask for signs, Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to a Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness." The Jews couldn't get over the fact that this Messiah, or this one who claimed to be the Messiah, was crucified. That just isn't acceptable, socially speaking. Everyone knew that good men just don't die on a Roman cross. And so the message of the cross was foolishness to the Greeks, and it was a stumbling block to the Jews. Jesus was crucified outside the camp. Well, the message of the Hebrew writer is this: we need to be willing to do the same thing. Let's continue reading now in verse 13 of the passage. "Hence, let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." If Jesus died outside of acceptability and respectability, then why would we think that Christians should be spared the experience of sharing his same fate? Look at how Jesus put it in John chapter 15. Verse 18 says, "The world hates you. You know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they'll keep yours also. He says, listen, I'm the master, you're the slave, so don't expect any greater treatment. If they put me to death, then they're going to put you to death. If their society, their culture did not accept me, they're not going to accept you either. Jesus said that the attitude of the world towards his apostles would be hatred because they hated me also. Because they are radically different from the culture around them. The fact that we follow Jesus makes us different from our culture. A life of faith has always meant living a life that's different from the culture around you. And you think about that. That was true of these heroes of the faith that the Hebrew writer mentioned just 2 chapters before this in Hebrews chapter 11. When you think about that, Joseph wasn't a great man because he adopted the moral values of other people around him in Potiphar's house. Daniel wasn't a great man because he made sure that he ate the same things that all the other young men were eating around him in Babylon. The Hebrew writer says that our faith takes us outside the camp in a culture where Christianity seems absurd to most people. The striking thing, though, about the statement here in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 13 is the reminder that our legitimate place as Christians is outside the camp. We need to understand the importance of that message. In fact, I believe New Testament Christianity will not survive until we understand this message. It is important and essential that we see ourselves as outside the camp of our culture. And we have to accept the fact that in doing so, we're going to be seen as different from the world. Sometimes radically different. And we've got to be willing to be different and seen as different. I'm not talking about isolating ourselves from the culture. That's what the medieval monks tried to do. They had this idea that they could just isolate themselves from wicked people. That they would be isolated from sin as well. So they would build up a wall, put sinners on the outside, and kept themselves on the inside. But that's not at all what I'm talking about. In fact, we can't do that. Jesus tells us that we have to have an influence on this world. He tells us in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but the salt has become tasteless. How will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. He also says you're a light of the world, that a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand it gives light to all who are in the house. And that let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. You see the importance there? That we are to let our light shine not for our own glory, but so that they will see us and say, I want to serve their God. I want that life that they have. We've got to stand out from our culture. And Jesus stressed the need for us to be an influence on the world around us. To accomplish that, obviously, we're going to have to live in this world. Paul, in dealing with the situation of withdrawal of church discipline in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he said, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral people, but he clarifies what he means by that. I didn't mean with the immoral people of this world or with the coveted or swindlers or idolaters, but then you would have to go out of this world. And he goes on to explain what I meant is to separate yourselves from unfaithful brethren. But what he acknowledges here is that we're going to have to live in this world. And we're going to have to associate with immoral people around us. That's just the way that it is. In fact, Jesus said in John chapter 17 and verse 15, I do not ask you, as he prayed to God, to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. I don't want them to leave this world, but instead what I need for them to do is to be kept from sin. So I'm not talking about keeping ourselves from society. But what I am talking about here is the problem that develops when we begin to adopt the same goals, the same culture around us. When we're immersed in the things of the world, we begin to talk like they do. And we begin to think like they do. And we begin to have the same priorities that they have. And when that happens, we become like all the other fish in the sea. We become indistinguishable from the people around us. We're no longer different. and we become comfortable inside of the camp of our culture. You have to realize that Christ calls us to take on a set of standards that appear to the world to be foolish. Remember what Paul said in Romans chapter 12, verse 2? Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. By changing your thinking, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. Don't be conformed to this world. Or as one person said it, don't allow the world to squeeze you into its mold. Don't just become another number. Don't just become like everyone else around us. And then there's a word that the Bible uses to sum up what we're talking about this week. And that word is sanctification. The word sanctification or sanctify literally means to be set apart. It's a noun that comes from a Greek word that means those who've been set apart. The people, when they are set apart, they are saints, which is a word that's used quite a bit of Christians in the New Testament. In fact, the word Christian is only used 3 times in the New Testament. Saints are used so much more than that. We are to be people set apart from the world. Those of us who are Christians are sanctified. But in order to be that, we have to be different. You know, the temple, for example, was a sanctified building because it was different from all the other buildings in Jerusalem. The Sabbath day was a sanctified day. It was a holy day because it was a day that was set apart from all the other days of the week. And likewise, Christians are sanctified people because we are different. We are set apart from the culture around us. We are different because we follow Jesus. We are different because we are governed by a different standard of right and wrong, a different set of ideas. And we need to recognize the truth that many times the world around us simply won't understand the things that mean so much to us. There are times where we will seem totally out of touch with the reality of things. That's one of the reasons that we need these times here together, brother, is so that we can recharge and we can recognize that we are a school of fish who are swimming together and we are helping each other. There was an experiment done one time by sociologists. It's interesting. Let me ask you a question. Stereotypically speaking, who is it that is better at math? Men or women? Now, you may not want to answer that question out loud, but I think most of us generally would say that men are better at math than women are. Now, obviously there are some women who are better at math than men, and there are some guys who can't do any good at math, okay? But stereotypically, we think of men as being better at math than we do women, right? Now, again, I'm being stereotypical here, but in our minds, what ethnic people in the world do we think of that are better at math than the rest of the world? Generally speaking, stereotypically, we think that Asians are better at math than anyone else. That's where engineers and all these other people come from. So scientists, sociologists wanted to know, they wanted to do an experiment. How would Asian women do in math, on math tests? Now, it's interesting what they found, because as they took these Asian women and they put them before the test. Before the test, they went to them, for example, and they went to these women. If they went to them and they said, you're going to take this math test, we want to see how you do, but we know that you're a woman, and women just typically don't do as well in math, so we'll see how it goes. If they stressed that, they didn't do good on their math. But if they went to them and said, listen, we know that you're an Asian, and Asians typically do well in math scores, then they did. They did well on their math scores, which is pretty fascinating, isn't it? The psychological term for that is called a stereotype threat, which simply means that we tend to perform on a level that is expected of us. Well, what does that have to do with us that are Christians? Well, instead of being Asian women, we are Christians in this culture. And we are children of God who live among the culture around us. And daily, we are, spiritually speaking, taking a test on holiness, on sanctification. And if we're being constantly reminded that we are part of this culture, then we're not going to do very well. But if we are reminded of the fact that we are children of God, then most likely we're going to do well on the spiritual test of sanctification. And that's why we desperately need this time together. On a regular basis, as this congregation meets 3 times a week, that's why we need to be here every time that we can, because we need a reminder of who we are and whose we are. It's difficult to keep our identity when we feel all alone, when we're swimming around in this big ocean all by ourselves. But we're not asked to follow Jesus Christ alone outside the camp. We are called to do it together. We share a community of believers who share the same convictions. And with the strength that comes from that fellowship, we can venture out into this hostile world there that attempts to influence us to follow outside the camp. Well, let's look at one last verse here in Hebrews chapter 13, the very next verse. In verse 14, the Hebrew writer goes on to say this. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we're seeking the city which is to come. So the Hebrew writer reminds his readers that the reason why we're willing to be different, the whole reason that we are willing to be looked down upon others around us in our culture today, is because we are looking for a city that is to come. That's our reward. That's the goal. That is the end of the journey. We leave to go outside the camp because, like Abraham before us back in Hebrews chapter 11, he was searching for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That's what we're searching for. We don't live inside the city now because we are looking for a different kind of city. You know, before Alina and I go on a trip, we have to consider whether or not it's worth going on or not. And we've been known to go 2,000 miles in 1 week, seeing old friends, visiting with family, maybe going to see a graduation of a family member or a wedding of a loved one. All of those things make it worth it. But if we were driving that far merely to see the world's largest boot in Minnesota, and that's a thing, or the largest ball of twine, I think in Iowa is where that is, then let me tell you, I would turn around. I'm not even sure I'd start on that trip, to be honest with you, because that doesn't interest me at all. If there's not something at the end that makes it worthwhile, then you're going to quit traveling. And that's what the Hebrew writer is saying here. It's not easy, this trip that we're on. Trying to be different, trying to live outside the camp, trying to swim upstream from the rest of the world around us. Sometimes it gets very tiring to live counterculturally. But there's something at the end of our journey that makes the journey worthwhile. But the only way to get there is to be willing to follow Jesus outside the camp. And to do so is to mark yourself as being very different. And it is to subject yourself to the reproach of the culture around us, like a fish out of water. As Christians, we've got to be willing to leave the camp of our culture. And what I'm calling for you to do this week is not to become Amish. That's not it at all. It doesn't even mean that you have to give up your smartphone, although there may be some things on your smartphone that you need to give up. But it does mean that you have to be willing to give up the ideas that are driving the culture around us, that maybe we as Christians sometimes come to accept as normal, that this is just the way it is, but in fact is at odds with God's Word. And so for the rest of the week, we're going to be, Lord willing, examining some of these cultural norms that our culture has accepted, that we might be tempted to embrace. It may be that we are tempted to embrace God's, or the culture's way of view of marriage. That it's not a permanent thing like God says that it is in this life. Or maybe we're tempted to raise our kids like the rest of our culture is. Or maybe we're tempted to give into sexual promiscuity. Or maybe we're tempted to give into the world's view of money and materialism. What we're trying to do is fight against that kind of thing, and not embrace what the world around us is doing. May we desire to live outside of the camp like Jesus did. Thank you very much for your attention.